Okay, so let's take a look at section 1.3. In this section we want to look at ways of measuring and studying data. Okay, so often we wish to compare variables. We have members from our sample. So we have, I'm going to call these sampling units or sample units. So just members from our sample and ultimately our population, and we collect information about them. So we measure variables about them, and often we're looking to see if there's a relationship between variables. So we have these sampling units, and we want to know if there is a relationship between variables. Okay. So one way to do this is to take a single sampling unit. So we take one sample unit and we measure two different variables. So variable 1 and variable 2. So for example, we have a classroom of 6th graders, and we want to measure the height, and we want to measure the weight. Okay, and the purpose, we're trying to establish a relationship. Is there, in other words, answer the question, is there a relationship between a student's height and weight? And that relationship might be in the form of, well, the taller a person is, the heavier they are, or maybe the relationship is the taller the person is, the lighter they are. Okay, so we're just trying to capture that sense of what is the relationship between height and weight, but it's not a causal relationship, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So this idea is known as the correlational method. So we're looking to see, is there an association between variable 1 and variable 2. Okay, so this association, like I mentioned, is not a causal relationship. It doesn't mean that I can make somebody taller and therefore they will be heavier, but it is a correlational connection, and correlation is something we'll study towards the end of this semester. So correlational method is an association between two variables. Okay, now we might let's take a look at an example. We might look at, like I mentioned, some elementary students or maybe some sixth graders, and we might, so let's look at 6th graders, and we might measure or rank how good of a breakfast they had. So let's see, quality of breakfast. That'll be our first variable. So maybe we give it a score 1 to 5, with 5 being exceptional and 1 being very poor. And then we also might look at, let's say, their performance in school. And again, we might rank this on a 1 to 5. Well, I think we do 1 to 4, but that's okay. So the idea here is that if a student has a really high quality breakfast, does that mean they're going to do better in school? Okay, that isn't something we can necessarily assess, right? I mean, it doesn't. The quality of breakfast isn't necessarily determining the performance in school, but there is a strong association. So in other words, if the quality goes up, we might often see the performance will go up. Okay, it doesn't mean quality is dictating performance, but the association is, as quality increases, performance increases. Okay, so it's not a causal relationship. There's a, what we say, a lurking variable here. There might be a reason that a student is getting a better breakfast, and that reason might also be influencing why they're doing better in school. Okay, so we're not saying that the breakfast dictates school performance, but we're seeing the relationship. As quality of breakfast increases, performance in school increases. Okay. There's other ways of measuring data. One of these ways would be to look at different variables from different units. So we're going to look at what's called an experimental study. Okay, the critical conditions for an experimental study: we have to be able to control all experimental conditions, and we have to be able to manipulate variables. In other words, we are looking to see a causal relationship here. Okay, so if we can control all experimental conditions and manipulate only one variable, then we would be able to see if our variable that we're manipulating influences an output. So in this case we have two variables still, but we have what we call an independent variable. Okay, and this is the one we manipulate. Okay, and after we manipulate this, we observe the response variable. Okay, so if we can determine that we manipulate the independent variable and we see a response, then we've established a causal relationship. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this idea of controlling the variable. Okay, so this idea is saying, okay, if we can block all other conditions that could change, so all other varying conditions, and leave the only varying condition, the one that we want to manipulate. So let's take a look maybe at a drug trial. Okay, drug trial. So we want to see if a particular drug has an effect on a condition. So the way we're going to control this right, so in order to make sure that it's the drug that's having a positive effect on the patients, we use two different groups of patients. So control happens by using at least two groups. Okay, so we have this idea of a control group. They don't receive the drug, and in order for them to think that they are, we give them what's called a placebo. So there's no drug here. Okay, we go about treating them the same way we would for the experimental group. Sometimes this is known as the treatment group. So the experimental group does get the drug. Receives drug. Okay, and therefore the only difference between these two groups of patients is that one receives the drug and one doesn't. Now we can measure, so the independent variable would be receiving pill or not, and then the response variable would be maybe patient outcome. Okay, we can also do look at data that comes from a non-experimental study. So non-experimental study. Now it might be that this is kind of an experiment, but we're lacking control, where we do have two groups and we do manipulate something, but we can't control who's in each group. So for example, if self-selection through volunteers or something of that nature, maybe we're looking at a observational study where we conduct a survey, or we're looking at gender, for example, and we're trying to distinguish differences between genders, and therefore you're not selecting, you can't control who's in each group because it's based on gender. So in these non-experimental studies, we often lack a control group. Okay, or we're lacking the idea of a manipulation, and that would be the case of a survey. Okay, we lack control group, but either case we do have multiple groups, and we can manipulate something, and that thing that we manipulate is known as the quasi-independent variable. Alright, let's take a look at an example of a non-experimental study. In the book, on the top of page 17, they're looking at ways of creating differences in groups without actually being able to control it. And one of those ways is by using gender, right? So we have an ability to test, students. Maybe we give a 10th grade class math test, and we can look at the differences between male versus female. Okay. Another way of having a control might be age. So you might be looking to see, what's the difference between, people that are less than 15 years old versus greater than 15 years old. Okay, so you're able to stratify your population into two groups, and you can do this, you don't have to, you can do more than two groups, but we're saying, okay, let's look at a group that's less than 15 versus a group that's greater than 15, and we're going to measure the same variable for both groups, okay, and then we can compare and see if there is a difference. This example on page 17 also uses the idea of time. Okay, in this sense, we're going to have a before versus the after. Right, so before, in this example, before treatment, and then looking at the scores after treatment and seeing if there's a difference. So there's lots of ways of creating this stratification, and we use these non-numerical kind of variables to distinguish. These are categorical variables. We have gender, age, time. The list, you can have a lot of different ways of creating these different groups, but the idea is that we have groups that we don't control who goes in there, but we can look to see if there's a difference.